Hello, thank you all for coming out to this Berkman Talk lunch. I'm David Weyerberger. We'll get to Dries in just a moment because you're here to hear and speak with Dries Buytaert. He will correct my pronunciation, I hope, very first thing that he does, and I apologize. But there are some things you should know before we get started, which first thing is, this is live. So anything that you say can be heard by the world. It is also being recorded. So everything you say can be heard by the world forever. So please say whatever you would like, but just, it's the internet, so keep that in mind. Dries is going to give a talk, and then we'll open it up for discussion. We will end at 1:15. Please feel free to use whatever hashtags make you happy, but the #Berkman is one good one. And at Dries, when you're tweeting, also at Berkman Center on Twitter. It's Berkman Center. Okay, for your tweeting pleasure. So here's the extent of my introduction. Almost all of it, in fact, is written here, except that Dries has left out that he is the founder and inventor of Drupal as well as its project lead. He's a much more modest title on the screen. He's also co-founder and CTO of Acquia. And with that, let me welcome Dries here. Thank you so much for coming.
Hey everybody, is this working? Is it? No. All right. I can't hear it. Interesting. Thanks for the introduction, David. So my name is Dries. I started the Drupal project, a long time ago, 15 years ago, out of my dorm room in Antwerp, where I was living at the time. Nowadays, I live in the Boston area, actually. So I moved from Belgium to, United States about 5-6 years ago. And for the first 7 years, I ran Drupal as a hobby project. I went to work at a little startup in Belgium building real-time operating systems and Java virtual machine, machines. But at night and during the weekends, I would work on Drupal. It was my true passion, trying to play with different things on the web. And at the time, very much Drupal was an experimental platform for me to play with things like RSS and blogging, and, community features and things like that. When I left the little startup that I worked on, I went on and did a PhD in computer science. My PhD had nothing to do with Drupal or the web. It was all about Java virtual machines. Doesn't really matter. But when I finished my PhD, I decided to turn my passion into my full-time job. And so I started a company called Acquia, which is actually based here in Boston. So I started it from Belgium in Boston. We have since grown to over 750 people. People don't notice that we're one of the fastest growing private technology companies in the United States. So we've been around for about 7 years commercially, and we work with large users of Drupal specifically. So we build products and services around Drupal. So this is me in my dorm when I started Drupal. And a lot of things have obviously changed since these early days, and most recently, Drupal turned 15 years old, and we also released Drupal 8 on the same day, and we celebrated that, with 240 parties all around the world, which is kind of cool. Today Drupal is used by roughly 3% of all the websites in the world, so millions of websites. We have a very large and active community of contributors. There are over 35,000 people contributing to Drupal today, which is pretty exciting. But obviously, a lot has changed since the day I started Drupal and today. And on this slide, you can read a few examples, but when I started Drupal, I felt like I could wrap my arms around everything that was going on the web. And today, obviously, that's almost impossible to even know what's going on. But like Google was still a private company at the time. I remember while I was working on Drupal, before I released the first version of Drupal, Google had just launched AdWords and had like 500 customers. And so obviously today, their advertising business alone is a $65 billion business. And so just to think about the impact of advertising and how that changed on the web, it's kind of a big deal. But half of the people had cell phones back in the day, and AT&T only had just launched text messaging a few months before. And so this idea of the mobile web just didn't exist. Obviously, social media, Facebook, Twitter, they only were born many years later. Open source, so Drupal is open source. Open source was still something that people were trying to understand. And companies like Microsoft and others, they would put out these memos, leaked or on purpose, I don't know, sharing that they felt threatened by the open source movement. And so, very interesting time. Today, obviously, mobile is a big deal, social media is a big deal, open source is extremely well accepted and continues to grow. But Google is one of the largest technology companies in the world. So, and Drupal survived all of these changes in the market, and I think we survived them because we've always sort of thought ahead. We've always been thinking, where do we need to go to stay relevant? And then we managed to navigate our community to be at the right time at the right place. And so we're 15 years old, but we continue to gain momentum. All right, I mentioned the birthday. And so if you go back in time and you think about how things were, and if you think about how things are today, back in the day, there was a lot of small websites that were connected through Google. People would search them, but then over time, there's these bigger platforms that started to emerge. Companies like Google, as I mentioned, LinkedIn, Facebook. And I feel that today, they've grown so big that they're actually starting to squeeze a lot of these smaller sites or sort of out of the picture. And the way people consume the internet can literally be through these platforms. There's been research, which you may all be aware of, that basically states that a lot of people think Facebook is the internet. If you ask people, what is Facebook, they'll say, Facebook is the internet. And so I think that is a bit of a challenge personally. And so today I want to talk about the open web, some of the trends in the market, and I'd love to discuss how we can try and save the open web. Right? And so before we do that, I'd like to share a few thoughts myself, and maybe first try to define what do we mean with the open web and what do we mean with the closed web. Right? Because I think aligning on some sort of a definition is probably useful, a useful start. So when we talk about the closed web, we typically refer to these walled gardens. It's also how the media refers to them. It's companies like Facebook and Apple and Google that capture a lot of data. But at the same time, I think what makes this interesting is that the walled gardens, even though they have a lot of data, they try to attract everybody to their sites, they're also doing some good things. If you think about Google, if you think about Facebook, they've literally brought millions, even billions of people online. And they provided a better experience for them, enabling them to connect with one another. In the process, there's lots of great stories of how these platforms have a really meaningful impact on even democracy, on human rights, and how they've been able to drive change in the world. So this is where it gets difficult, right? Because they have a lot of data, there's real concerns around privacy and the likes. At the same time, they're also really helping a lot of people. If you think about the fact that things like Google give people that have internet access, pretty much instant access to critical information, can be life-changing for a lot of these organizations, or people, I should say. So I think what's scary about those is their scale. You know, Google and Facebook have over 1 billion users each. I think Facebook is 1.6 billion active users each month. Apple has over 1 billion iOS devices. And it's that scale combined with the fact that they are able to shape the news. There's a study from Politico that says that Google could actually influence the results of the American election by just tweaking their algorithm and showing search results a little bit different. So they're literally able to shape the news. Facebook can show you everything, right? So they're deciding what status updates are they going to show you. So they could build in a bias, either on purpose or by accident. I'm not saying they're all evil, but bias can be introduced. They track an awful lot of data about all of us, and I'll show that in a second. I think that's potentially a reason for concern, and frankly, I don't think they'll stop until they know everything about us. And I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But if you think about what they know, I tried to create a diagram for some of these big platforms. Amazon is the first one. LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, Apple. And then try to visualize kind of what information they know about us. And it's pretty terrifying if you think about it. And Google probably knows the most of us. Because, I use Gmail. So they have all my email. Google Ads is on, I don't know what their market share is for advertising, but probably 90% of the advertising is using Google Ads. And so they know every website that I go to. And based on that, they can determine my interests. They tried Google Plus, so they have all this information about my social network and the likes. And in fact, you should try a few searches. Like if you search just in google.com for an Amazon order that you placed, it will actually show you on google.com your Amazon order reformatted by Google. I don't know if you ever tried this. The receipt of your Amazon purchase has to go into your Gmail though, but they're able to parse these things and know what you buy. It's not just an email in your inbox, it's an actual thing for them that they know. And in my opinion, these platforms could evolve to the point that they basically have all these things checked. I think that's, if you think about a lot of the acquisitions they do and new features that they launch, almost always there is this ability to check another box. Which I think is interesting. Amazon recently announced that they're starting a mail service, for example. Allows them to gather email. And so I think this is a concern. But the challenge here is that they do this because they can actually build and deliver a better user experience. The fact that Google knows so much about you is actually not necessarily a bad thing. If you think about Google Now, how many people know Google Now? Some people? Well, so they basically push you relevant information at the right time, and they can do so because they know all these things about you. They know where you're going, they know who your next meeting is with, and all of these things. So I think this is really important because I do believe that these walled gardens are winning because it's so easy, right? People use Facebook because it's very easy to stay in touch with your friends and family. For me, for example, I moved from Belgium to the US. For me to stay in touch with my friends and family before Facebook, I would have to give them a phone call and ask, hey mom, how are things? Or hey friends, how are things? And now I can just, tap into this stream of status updates from all my friends and all my family in a way that's much easier and much more scalable. And so that's why these platforms are winning. Same thing with LinkedIn and Apple and the likes. All right, so if you go back to a definition real quick, so there is this idea of the open web, and and David will notice, but back in the day, there was something about creative freedom. Everybody had their own website, and you could express yourself. You could make that website purple or green with blue dots, or anything you wanted to do, right? You could create an experience. You could represent yourself with unlimited creative freedom. There's also something serendipitous about the web, and to some extent there is still today, but I remember the evenings where I would get lost on the web and ended up reading all these pages and then get lost again and ended up on this section of the web, and I feel that's gone a little bit, to be honest. Like, we just scroll our Facebook feed and that's it. We have much more control, not only over the experience and how we present ourselves, but also over our data and to some extent over our privacy. And all of these things are sort of decentralized. And there's open standards that emerge that try to connect some of these things, and Google and other search engines that try to kind of make sense of this decentralized chaos that was the web. And so contrast that with the closed web, and people's Facebook profiles look pretty much identical. There's no creative freedom in those things. Algorithms, as I mentioned, decide what we see and what we don't see. It's getting worse and worse in some regards with Flipboard and Apple News and Facebook and LinkedIn. They all filter and curate what we see. And there's a thin line between curation and censorship, for example, and something to think about. Privacy, it's all over the news all the time, but obviously there's questions around privacy, and a lot of that information is siloed with a handful or maybe a dozen of large companies, and it can be bad. And there's many examples of this in the media. WeChat is it's basically the app that people use in China, and it's kind of a Facebook plus apps, if you will. And so there was an Uber app in the WeChat app. If you've never seen it, it may be a little hard to imagine, but the holding company behind WeChat then decided to buy another ride-sharing company, if you will, and then instantly kicked out Uber from WeChat. And so these big platforms can be a little terrifying in terms of how they handle these kinds of things. Twitter once had a completely open API where everybody could build their own Twitter client. At some point they said, we're not going to allow that anymore because we want to monetize all of the clients that exist. So they closed down their open API in favor of making more money. Facebook, with Free Basics, trying to launch free internet to countries like India, and then deciding to do that on their terms, where they can use Facebook and a few other things, but not completely free internet. So these platforms have a lot of power. To Google, as I mentioned, being able to bias what you search and the results, to the point that they can influence the result of elections. So there's a lot of questions in my mind about this. At the same time, and I'll bring these things together in a second, I want to talk about a few trends. And for those people that have been following my blog, I've written about all of those, but one of the things I've been talking about for a while is this idea of the big reverse of the web. If you want to know all the details, you can go to my blog, but the idea is, I believe that we're in sort of a transformational phase of the web, where we're kind of flipping the web on its head, where the way things used to work is people would go to multiple sites and get the information that they wanted. If you wanted to get the news, you would go to the New York Times, maybe then you would go to another site, and every morning people would wake up and go to a list of all these sites to find the information that they wanted to find. In the future, and it's already happening, information will come to you. Instead of you having to go to the source, information will increasingly come to you, not just information, but also services and products. And it's this idea of that content will find you, and it will find you at the right time, on the right device. And so it's a big technology trend that we're all trying to go after. But I think it's significant if you know, it's important to understand when we talk about the future of the web, and it will become clear in a second here. Second trend is data is eating the world. Again, all these companies capture that data and they use that data, and they use it in combination increasingly more with machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the likes too. Again, you know, all these things combined basically to give you the right information or the right service at the right time on the right device, and they try to do that in a data-driven, you know, smart way. So I have a couple of, you know, slides about this. You know, there's an example of sort of getting a notification, and they often call this mobile or contextual moments. It's this idea, if today you pull up your phone and you're at the airport, stranded, like I was this weekend, and you go to the airline website, it basically asks if you want to book a new ticket. I don't want to book a new ticket. I want to figure out when, you know, where my flight is and why why it's canceled or why it's postponed. So I want to contextually relevant experiences. Or when I arrive at an airport and my luggage is lost, I don't want to book a new flight. I want to find my luggage. And so building these kinds of smart experiences or contextual or mobile moments, I think, is where the future is at. Data will be behind that. They need to know where my luggage is. They need to integrate with a luggage service in this particular example. So it's all about building these data-driven experiences. And artificial intelligence will be underpinning all of these things. And again, all of these things combined will lead to a better user experience. But it will also raise a lot of questions. And so I've long believed that this is true, that user experience always wins. Now, people actually don't necessarily think hard about how their data is used or the ramifications of sharing all of their data, that they'll just do whatever is most convenient, right? So that's important to keep in mind. And so if you think about the future of the web, you know, will it be an open web or will it be a closed web? And I don't necessarily have the answer. I think it literally could go either way. But I think we need to think about how can we build, you know, transparent algorithms, you know, that we understand how they work. How can we build data-driven algorithms, because that's where the future is at. You know, it's to be data-driven, that help us discover information and that do not exclude serendipity, for example. How can we take back control over our privacy and our data and how that's used? And how can we break these silos, that handful of large platforms, and, you know, try to decentralize them in a way that that we can still offer the best user experience? And it's really hard. You think about how do we compete with Google when the way to compete is having all that data, all that compute power, and all these resources. How do we do that in a decentralized way? Obviously, not exactly easy, right? And so, I think there's a couple of things that we want. One, I think we need more transparency. We need to know what data is captured. We need to know how that data is used, but also how these algorithms work. And so I've been talking about this idea, and I'm still not sure if it's the best idea, but it's this idea that we need an FDA for data and algorithms. Like, if you have these large platforms like Google that have an impact on society, that can influence outcomes of elections, as just one example, it would be good if somebody could actually audit these algorithms to make sure there's no bias built into them, again, either on purpose or by accident. So this is one of the things I'd love to get your input in once we're through the slides. Is this a way to do it, or is there a better way to get to get these companies to do the right thing if they're not doing the right thing. If you think about the history of the FDA, it was introduced many, many years ago, but it was the same kind of idea. People started to produce food, mass-produce food. People started to invent drugs. At some point, the government had to step in to make sure that these things were well, met certain quality standards and the like. So, and if we want to do this for data and algorithms, how would we do it? Because it's not exactly easy, right, to audit an algorithm. Maybe we need algorithms to audit the algorithms. Do we, it's not like somebody can go through all the lines of code at Google to say that things are working well. All right. So, second thing I think we need to protect our data, and specifically privacy and control. And again, something I've been talking about for a while, not in a lot of detail, is this idea of a personal information broker. It's the idea where you unbundle Facebook and Google and try to store the information in one place that you control, but make it available through APIs to these platforms and be in charge of how much data you share, how long you share it for, what they can use it for, and the like. And Facebook does actually do a little bit of that. If you use Facebook Connect to log into a website, you guys done that? It will tell you Facebook or this site would like to access this and this information from Facebook. And I think that's actually the right way to go. But we need to do it, I think, across all these platforms. Some organizations are experimenting with this. I don't think any of them have real traction, but I'd love to see this work. So one question could be, how do we make this work? Sorry, it was an animation. All right, I think the last thing that we need is decentralization and a better user experience. And this one is also incredibly difficult. Like, how can we, it's not good enough to be as easy to use as Google and Facebook. For the open web to win, we actually need to be much easier to use than them. It's not about getting, parity there. It's about beating them at user experience, which is a tremendous challenge. I personally believe this is where open source can come in, and open standards. I think we need to figure out open standards that allow us to build a layer of technology that enables different sites, different apps, different whatever you call it, to communicate, and actually make that very easy to use. And this is where it gets really tricky, because how do you make it easy for people to leave a comment on all these different sites without them having to create an account or having to log in? And can we build other layers in the technology stack that help facilitate that? And so, to wrap it up, these are just a couple of ideas of things we could try to do. FDA idea, personal information broker, more standards in open source. And while it looks almost impossible, in a way, I do think that open source projects like Drupal that have reach can have a meaningful impact at least. And I really believe that, we have to try. We have to do something, because today the web is used by billions of people. Tomorrow it's going to be used by even more people. I mean, think about how many people depend on this thing. And some of the changes that are happening, the things that I mentioned with machine learning, the things that I mentioned with data-driven experiences, the Internet of Things, all of these technologies coming together will accelerate the development of the web. And that won't be linear. It will be exponential acceleration of what's possible. And it will change everything, I think. It will change every business model. It will change every industry. It will change every country. And it will impact every life. some of these changes that are ahead of us. And so I honestly believe we have a huge responsibility to build the web that we want to build. To build the web that's a great foundation for all these people for decades to come. And so, obviously, going to take a lot of effort and a lot of help, but we need the smartest people, to step in and help, I think. Because otherwise we'll end up with 5 players that define the web. So, with that, I'd like to say thank you and start a discussion. I think we have lots of time for questions. I think. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Buchenheimer, and my question is about what we actually have at the moment with the web and with all of the systems. And when you have a mismatch, as you know with your airport example, between the modeling that's been done and reality, and I'm sure everybody in this room has had an experience where somebody told them that there was, that what they knew themselves, your package has been delivered.
Right.
It's in the computer, it's been delivered. This can lead to a great deal of frustration and a lot of human energy chasing some bad information in the computer.
Yeah. I'm not sure why your package was missed, but yeah, I mean, it could be a variety of different reasons, obviously. But I think it speaks to the importance, as we build these systems, right, that deliver packages or that we become increasingly dependent on. I think one of the biggest challenges will be around reliability, resiliencies. I mean, if a system goes down, all of a sudden, things stop functioning. And so I think there's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of tools and processes that need to be built up to make all of these things work really well. And we see that with our customers, for example, as well. Like a lot of them are moving to the cloud because that gives them that greater resiliency and consistency, and gives them that foundational layer on which they can build. So we're building layers and layers on top of each other that become stronger and stronger. So I think it's something that we'll overcome over time. The dependence on systems is a little scary. Yeah.
Hi, I think this was a very good talk, but I want to take issue with your concept of an FDA for algorithms. A while ago, someone came up with the concept of a cathedral versus the bazaar.
Right.
And an FDA for algorithms sounds very much in the direction of a cathedral.
Right.
Maybe what we really need is a consumer report for algorithms, or maybe a wiki algorithmica that will warn people about the consequences of algorithms. FDA sounds like something like China might think of in order to try to control what people see. And I think there's a tendency for more of a centralization of a lot of these things, partially for government control and security, and partially for monetization. And I think what we might need is more competition in an open source framework with some good information to help people choose.
Right. I think it's a good feedback. Again, I don't have the answer here, to be honest. If a system like that could work, it may be more scalable than an FDA-like approach. People trust it as well. So yeah, I'll have to think a little bit about that. What comes to mind are questions like, if a system like that would work, why don't we use it for drugs? Why don't we use it for food? I don't know. I tend to believe in sort of Darwinian approaches where we can try different things and hopefully the best solution will bubble to the top and survive. So I'm all for trying multiple things and see what works best. Just trying to wrap my head around how we would even start to do that. And I think we would need I think you need maybe some level of access to the data, to do a good, like in-depth review. Yeah, something to think about.
Actually, I'm going to jump in with a question.
Yeah.
If that's okay. So I love everything that you're saying, and I have deep fears about the closing of the web. But there are efficiencies of size that enable Google to be able to search the way that it does. I mean, they have basically power plants. It takes a lot of capital. And there's the networking effect for something like Facebook.
Right.
Both of those seem, even if the data was externalized and they're dealing with open APIs that everybody could access, they would still have somewhat natural, I'm going to say, advantages that tend toward centralization. Do you see any way around the networking effect and the economy of scale issue?
Well, it's kind of hard. I don't know. I don't have a crisp answer, but I have sort of a hopeful attitude. If you think about the web and how it's evolved, it has kind of swung between closed and open over time. Was born open when Tim Berners-Lee created the web. They had, obviously it was meant to be an open system where all academics could collaborate and share. And then AOL came along and was a very closed web in many ways, where you could browse the web through the lens of AOL. And then we got out of that, like I feel, in the early 2000s or late 90s. When Google was emerging, I felt the web it felt open to me. So now it feels like it's closing again. So it's going back and forth, and I don't know exactly how we overcome economies of scale, but it usually takes sort of a fundamentally different approach to doing things. Like how we went from AOL to, say, the Google era. It was a disruptive innovation, for lack of a better word, that caused the old model to stop functioning. And so I don't know what that is, but I'm hopeful that at some point we'll have some sort of breakthrough that will render that economy of scale maybe less useful. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer to that question. Yeah. This one there, and then.
Great. So I'm Jason Griffey. I'm a fellow here at the Berkman Center. Let me just follow up a little bit on the FDA. We've had several speakers over the course of the year suggest something very much like a governmental agency to do some oversight on things, and I'm becoming convinced that this is becoming convinced over the course of these talks that this might be something that is worth pursuing. One of the difficulties that I see arising from this, and if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them, is the fact that we have non-government actors in the form of Google and everything that have the ability to simply flee, right? Like, if we instantiate an FDA for algorithms, they can run away to greener pastures.
Right.
It's not entirely monetarily easy, and there's a lot of infrastructure and all of that, but there are many, many, many sorts of legal things they can do in order to hide themselves on the Cayman Islands or whatever. Right. So, are we talking about a UN? We have to kind of bump the scale. Is that the way that this gets rectified, or is there something new that needs to happen?
That's a good question, and I'm not a policy person, or unlike many of you, an expert in law and these kinds of things. But yeah, something may need to happen. And I think that the problem exists to some extent today, right? I think, what happens when somebody in another country uses Facebook to do something illegal? Like, I don't know what the law says about these things, but I imagine that there's some things in place, and if there's no things in place, we probably should do something in place. But obviously, to your point, the internet is a global phenomena, and traditional borders don't apply to a lot of these things. Everybody uses Google. Everybody uses Facebook. So maybe I think it would be healthy if we did it at the local level, because if one country does this, it will probably, hopefully, automatically become available to other people in other countries. But it could be more effective to do it globally, for sure.
Is there somebody who wants,
point.
since,
I just,
Rob, would you like to
I'd
jump
love to
in here?
follow up on the FDA thing, because I'm really puzzled by what the FDA would do. Like, I understand banning certain food products that have been demonstrated to be unhealthy or poisonous. I understand putting a label on there. What would this do? Would it say that warning, this news feed is tilted towards the right, or you're going to see more cat pictures? What are we fighting here, and how would you do it? And I don't mean to be flip, but I truly don't
No
understand.
offense taken.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I can try to answer unless somebody wants to chime in as well, but I think, at a minimum, I think if these large platforms have a bias, I think it would be good to disclose it, personally. So they could ask them to disclose their biases if they have any. That's probably all they could do, I imagine. I mean, they can't mandate them to be neutral, I don't think. I think they could.
You have to then define what a bias is and
Right.
how that
That's
bias
hard.
is, and you don't even know if the platform knows that they have a bias.
Right.
So it's complicated.
It's very complicated. I think there was it's been a while since I read this story, but there was a story, I think it's a few years old, where I'm actually not entirely sure if it's super relevant to your question or your point, but there was a story about people would search, use Google to search for images of criminals. Do you know this story? And a lot of photos of black people would show up, and the reason was because Google learned from clickstream behavior and people clicking on things, and so Google, unfortunately, learned. Actually, because of the visitors and users of Google had a racist bias towards thinking that black people tend to be, or more likely to be, criminals or something. Google learned that to show photos of black people when you search for criminals, and so that's not right, And so hopefully somebody. I mean, Google corrected this, and this was not something they did on purpose. It was an artifact, I guess, of their algorithm. But it would be good if somebody would make sure that that doesn't, stay there if these things are discovered. Then I don't know. I would imagine they would make sure these things are handled appropriately. I don't know. In full disclosure, I'm not totally convinced of the idea for an FDA either. I think it could be very helpful, but I also have questions about it. But I'd love to, if you have an alternative idea, I'd love to hear.
In that, let's broaden that.
Yeah.
Is this relevant to the FDA or the international law?
Well, this is sort of tangentially related to this FDA discussion and how this might affect the sort of content that you're seeing. Going back to your idea of sort of, I've heard this described in a bunch of ways. I keep hearing personal data store. Everything that you have, all this information about you, it's kept somewhere that you can keep it safe and you can decide what companies get access to what information about you. That's awesome. That's fantastic. There's a huge advance in many ways, but the sort of insidious after effect of this, I think, is going to be pretty dramatic in terms of the content that you get. If companies like Facebook and Google no longer have immense amounts of free or very cheap data about your preferences, your movements, your so on and so forth, if this is coming at some sort of price to them, either you're charging them for it or it's more of an issue of scarcity, that cost is going to be passed along to the people who are making the most of it, the advertisers and so forth. We've already seen, and I come out of journalism, so maybe I'm a little bit biased as far as this is concerned, this rise of sponsored content, this rise of very, very sneakily tailored content for the needs of an advertiser or a service or a cause. Do you have any thoughts on how something like a personal data store might encourage that to just take off in this horrible, weird filter bubble kind of way?
No, it's a very good observation. Thank you. So I think there is a risk that it disrupts these business models around advertising, obviously. But I actually think it may also provide opportunity for them. And I'll give one example, whether it flies or not. So one of the challenges today, I sign up on a website. Every single website, I have to create an account, provide my address information, provide my credit card information, all of these things, right? And so then what happens is these stores start to send me physical mail, snail mail, or email, but they don't know when I move, as an example. And so their targeting just completely breaks when something changes in my personal life, whether it's I move to a physical location, their mail doesn't get delivered anymore. They keep sending it. Or my preferences change. I all of a sudden have a new interest. They don't know about it until I go back to tell them. But one opportunity of this personal information broker is if I decide to move and I update my address in one location, it could potentially, I'm just brainstorming, I guess, it could potentially be sent to all of the parties that have given access to my data, and that could make them more efficient. Or if all of a sudden I become really interested in, classic cars, or I'm not interested in classic cars, but imagine I become interested in classic cars. It wouldn't be bad for all these organizations that I've told them they can know my interests to kind of pick up this new interest without me having to go back and somehow tell them implicitly. And so while I agree with your point that it's disruptive, I think there could be opportunities to make them more effective as well. So it could be a win-win.
Is this on the same topic?
It is related to the data.
You're being very patient. We'll get to you for sure.
So you mentioned the web sort of swinging from open to closed to open, and it made me think regarding data. Do you see, with the Apple FBI case, for instance, you see companies trying now to remove their own access from certain data so that they don't have to turn it over? Do you see there maybe swinging to a point where collecting all this data ends up costing more because regulators come in and put on sort of financial regulation-esque limitations that will raise the compliance costs so high that having that data is less valuable than not having it?
Right. No, it's an interesting, I've never thought about it that way. It's an interesting observation. Not having the data could be cheaper, right? And could be safer in a way too, because if something happens, it doesn't maybe affect the brand. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting point. I don't know how that balances out, but and I think it's also a brilliant marketing strategy, obviously. It's a way for Apple to, because they still collect a lot of data, or they're capable of collecting a lot of data, although they do a pretty good job leaving the data on your phone, I think, or on your device. It's definitely a way to differentiate themselves from other companies too. So.
Hi. I think the financial auditing model, the requirements that are placed on publicly traded companies are another way to think about algorithms as opposed to the FDA sort of transparency and disclosure on steroids. But that wasn't the question I was going to ask about. I mean, this is a wide-ranging, really interesting talk. I want to sort of drill down on how, open source, open web, open standards might actually be able to compete
Right.
with this future. And I mean, one of the points you made is, that machine learning, artificial intelligence, is going to be more and more important. And I mean, it feels like it's about to become a commodity. So I think you're exactly right there. And the reality is that the stacks are largely open source to begin with. So open source, it may be necessary, but it isn't sufficient for competition. I mean, the other aspect that's let machine learning take off is the availability of data. There's suddenly, what's being implemented now was thought of in the 80s, but finally there's these huge corpuses of data, corpi of data, that can actually teach machines much more interesting things. And some of that data is open, some of it isn't. But, the third thing that's happening is money. I mean, it's the corporations like Google, Apple, Facebook. I mean, are investing huge amounts of money in their industrial research labs on this stuff. With only the tip of the iceberg being sort of public academic research. And sort of the depressing question I have is, I mean, how does the open source, open web, open standards community begin to compete with that sort of focus of resources from the proprietary, platform companies?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for your patience. Again, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, right? I think we can win if we actually succeed in collaborating. And I have a few answers to your question, but the first one is to look at Drupal as an example. We compete with proprietary software produced by companies like Adobe, Microsoft, Oracle, and they're great competitors. However, the innovation coming out of Drupal is way bigger than what's coming out of these organizations, because we've managed to scale Drupal to the point where we have millions of users, but we have 35,000 developers, contributors that are actively contributing to the the betterment or the advancement of Drupal, the software. And our competitors may have, I don't know how many developers they have on their CMS product, but let's say they have 200 or 300 or 50. They don't have 35,000, right? And so if we can organize ourselves, we actually get a lot of stuff done. The challenge is in getting everybody organized, getting everybody aligned on the same vision and all of these things, but maybe advances in collaborative software on how you collaborate, can help facilitate some of these things. When I started Drupal, we did everything by emailing. We emailed patches around. It wasn't very scalable, right? And now, with Skype and Google Hangouts and things like Slack and GitHub, all of these things didn't exist really at the time, and it has enabled us to scale how we work. It is more efficient. So maybe something like that could happen also, to go and do these things, to compete with these big platforms. That would be part one of my answer. Part two is, maybe government should fund more, universities to do some of this fundamental, work, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be done in these commercial organizations, but it could be done more for the greater good. So I think that would be interesting too. and I'm sure you guys would like that. I had a third point, but I'm spacing out here. What it was. Yeah, I forgot what it was, but obviously a huge challenge. Just the resources, not just human resources, compute power, data. If you look at IBM, they're kind of going through a very large transformation as an organization, and they've been, what they've been, the amount of resources they've been pouring into IBM Watson, for example, it's mind-blowing to try and be first at this machine intelligence or cognitive technology. And then they're spending billions buying data companies. They bought the Weather Channel for, I don't know, it was over $1 billion, I think, just to get that data, primarily, right? And so, it's obviously a huge challenge to compete if you don't have the data. So, maybe policy, I don't know. Again, I'm not a policy guy, but I don't think there's a silver bullet here. I think the way to win and to change it is, you have to do a lot of different things. So.
I want to go back to the FDA question for a moment. I think something that's been left out of the discussion is consumer literacy. The things that we're talking about are pretty rarefied here, and it's awfully hard to make privacy concerns feel sexy to the consumer. So for me, I think one pro for an FDA for data is that, I'm not a biologist, and I don't have the expertise to know what's a good medical study. And in the same way, I'm also not a coder, and I don't have the expertise to know what a good algorithm is or what a biased algorithm is. So the agency presumably would be making that determination for me, right? But on the other hand, I think we can see from the FDA that compliance can be costly and favor big producers. If you think about how factory farming works, right, there are all of these sanitation requirements for slaughtering animals that are hard for the small producer to live up to. So I think that's an interesting tension in this request, right? Is it the sort of thing that would be intended to make the web more free and open, but kind of backfire and make the big producers more powerful?
Good point. I hadn't thought about that myself. Yeah, what do you think? It's like a balancing act, and I don't know. We'd have to think about that for sure. Very good point. Yep.
Hi, I'm Matt, and so I've been thinking about this FDA question, and since you've been getting some pushback on it, actually sort of want to put out the case that I think it could be something that businesses might want. I like this idea of thinking about scope, because I think that there's a very big difference between what Bing does with its algorithm and what Google does with its algorithm as far as the scale of the effect. But also, a lot of times, businesses are consumers of algorithms, and algorithms do different things. And so sometimes you're going to be making like medical decisions with an algorithm as opposed to newsfeed and what you read decisions. And there's already all sorts of existing law that applies to the things that these companies do. So if I was a for-profit company looking for algorithms, I almost would feel more comfortable if some kind of government agency provided a certification of some sort that the algorithm complies with existing laws in the field, and then secondarily maybe doesn't have, unintended effects, not just for consumer purposes, but also for PR purposes and legal purposes. Maybe that's a defense. So I was just wondering, would you view this as like something like there'd be rules that apply to all players, or do you think that it would be something people opt into, and sort of what sorts of side effects do you think the agency would look at?
That's a good question. without having thought about it a whole lot, obviously, I think it would depend on the industry or maybe the application. Like, here's one example. Increasingly more people, or not, increasingly more they use DNA samples to determine whether somebody's guilty or not guilty. And that's algorithms. There is software involved that determine whether somebody goes to jail or doesn't go to jail. Interesting situation, because you would like that algorithm to work really well. So that there is no side effects of sending the wrong person to jail or having a person that should be in jail not go to jail, right? So just one, so in that domain, I guess, I think all the players should be subject to the same kind of scrutiny. And maybe be held to different standards. Another example would be self-driving cars. This has also been in the news, where the situation where a self-driving car needs to make a decision between killing its passengers or killing pedestrians. Like, if all of a sudden somebody runs over the street, and the self-driving car can either drive into a wall or drive over these people. That's a tough decision, obviously. I don't know if that's a good example of where we need clear regulation, and because obviously you want every car to do the same thing, because otherwise, if the Google car decides to run over the passengers, the Volvo's self-driving car decides to kill its passengers, more people are going to buy the Google car.
I'm going to call on myself. That's right. So this is on the FDA question, which seems to be the dominant question here. So I can think of two reasons to use a government to do this at FDA. One is to compel the search engines to contribute, to make their algorithms available. And the second is then maybe to force them to behave one way or another once you've discovered. So I wanted to make a suggestion, which somebody else brought up, which is a consumer report sort of thing, which has no government involved, which is... So suppose there were some set of people who are trustworthy, reliable, they're academics, they're professionals, and it's an independent organization that performs tasks based upon the results of queries. So you don't have to look at the algorithms, which is going to be really hard to do anyway. But you perform tests, you look at the results, and you're able to say, well, it looks like for the following, the evidence seems to show that Google disfavors Fox News. It covers more about Hillary Clinton than about Bernie Sanders, but Bing, and so forth. For this one, more porn results, fewer women result, or whatever. Just look at the results and tell us what they are. So that would be transparency without requiring anybody any of the engines to agree to it. Would that sort of thing accomplish your aim? Or are you looking for the regulatory side of it, where you then compel the search engines to be more fair?
No, I don't think they have to be more fair necessarily. No, it's an interesting question, and I don't have a really strong opinion either way. But at a minimum, I think it would be good to understand the bias. I think there's nothing wrong with curation per se. I mean, just like people know Fox News is reports differently than CNN, which reports differently than other media companies. So I think it could be fine for these kinds of things, for the reporting of news or finding information. I think some bias would be fine. Just gets really difficult when, if you handle data as complex as Google does, to actually understand their bias on a specific topic. It's impossible, right? So that is a little bit of a concern, and so disclosing that bias could be helpful.
And as you say, even the search engines don't always know their biases.
They don't, exactly.
Search for criminals.
Yeah. But then for other things, I think the DNA testing, maybe the self-driving cars example, I don't think disclosing your bias is enough, because as I mentioned, if one self-driving car has one bias and another self-driving car has another bias, it's not and so they're all going to do the same thing, which is not necessarily the best thing for society. And so to me, that's the question. When it really impacts society, it may not be enough to disclose your bias. You may actually need to be held to certain standards. So. Good.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Sarah, I'm also at the Berkman Center. This is actually going back to the privacy question, and what I've noticed is that a lot of conversations around protecting privacy are around the immediate or very near term, as in our lifetimes. And I'm curious your thoughts about the longer term, beyond our own lifetimes, especially things like personal messages in email or personal messages on Facebook, and whether this idea of having the broker of personal data could protect sort of our legacies, as in will our great-grandchildren have access to our personal emails? And is this a relevant question? Is there anything we can do now to prevent that?
To prevent that data?
That type of access to our private data in the future.
Yeah, it's a great question. Because some of the data I'd love to see, to keep available, right? I often wish that I had photos of my grandparents or something. And so we actually live in a time where our grandchildren may be able to learn a lot about us, which I think is exciting. No? And actually, I've thought about this, I would be happy to even pay a commercial service to say, I have photos on my blog, for example. Can I pay somebody that will then promise me to keep these photos on my blog for the next 400 years? Kind of an interesting business model. Because I actually would love for my grandchildren, if I'm lucky enough to have those, to be able to go and see, hey, look, here's some photos of Dries doing, I don't know, skiing.
When there was still snow.
Say that again?
What about on the other flip side, for example, things that you wouldn't want necessarily to move over time, whether biographers will have access to things that were meant to stay private.
Right, exactly.
Definitely. Is there anything you think we can do now as we're thinking about the way the web works to sort of protect secrets, for example?
The flip side is absolutely there. There's definitely things people don't want to keep around, or are not useful to keep around, maybe. But yeah, I don't know how we manage that actually. But it's a fascinating question. Yeah, great question. So I don't have a good answer.
So we barely have time for one more question. So a quick question and a quick answer.
I'll be fast.
Thank you.
Your talk mainly meditate about power and how we conceive power in our current times. And quoting a good author that I like in this moment says, the power it's easier to gain, harder to use, and easier to lose. And I like your points about decentralization and transparency. And I know that you used your own example of Drupal on the 35,000 collaborators that you have. For me, I see them like a, army of micro power against the big actors that control power on internet that you point at them. So my question is, do you talk with your micro army of powerful people about the importance of decentralizations and transparency and how to encourage them for doing more in that path?
Right. So it's a great question. As I mentioned, it's a great final question. Actually, I do believe we have a responsibility to try and build the web or the foundations of the future version of the web that kind of has the right values, has the right attributes. And so, I tried to, in between running Drupal and running Aqua, I tried to provide some thought leadership around these things because I know a lot of the people in the Drupal community read it. And as you mentioned, there are individual contributors that can help either spread that message or actually try and do something about it, right? So with the limited powers that I have, I try to activate others to help make a difference, which is also why I'm here. It's not every day I get to talk in front of an amazing group of people that are actually thinking about these questions more than I do, I imagine, especially at the Berkman Center. So, I'm excited to be part of the conversation and trying to contribute where I can, I guess, and enable others to contribute where they can.
It's not every day we get to talk with a leader and champion of the open web. So thank you. Thanks everybody. Also, thanks to the Berkman staff that always does an incredible and invisible job. So.